Hi, it's John, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Victor W. Hwang. Victor is the author of The Rainforest, which is a book I'm looking forward to talking a lot about today. He's also the founder of The Right to Start, which is a very important organization in the times we're in the middle of right now. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Victor. Hello, Victor.
Hello, John. Thanks for having me here.
It's a great pleasure. I did an okay job of introducing you, but I think you do a much better job. Can you just take a moment and tell us everything you've been doing beyond the book, The Rainforest, and in your career?
Sure. So I'm a serial entrepreneur, but I've also been an author and a writer and an investor. But then, unlike a lot of folks who are entrepreneurs and get involved in talking about their ideas, I've also been involved in looking at issues of economic growth. So I've been involved in consulting with institutions like the World Bank, with cities all over the country, with states and regions, and even entire countries on how you actually spur entrepreneurial-led economic growth. And that's really become a passion of mine because so much of what we know now about the importance of entrepreneurship and innovation is that that's the source of prosperity, it's the source of jobs, it's the source of growth. But then we hardly hear it talked about in our public discourse, in civic life, and in the broader economy at large. And so this is an issue that's become a passion of mine, and I'm really excited to talk with you more about it today.
I have to say, I've been a fan of the book for about 5-6 years now. I came across it at Swift and their InnoTribe group, who had hired you to help work on fostering their community. And I have to admit that it's been a passion ever since. And I found it particularly striking how you used these organic analogies to really get at the heart of how we drive those forces that create the life of society, as you'll go on to tell us a bit more about. Can you start by maybe giving people an idea of why you chose the rainforest as an analogy and what exactly you mean when you talk about that?
Yeah, the rainforest is really a metaphor that becomes reality. That is, when we think of our economy, we tend to think of it traditionally over the last 100+ years or so as more of a rigid system. That is the way that macroeconomists think of our society. But what we're really trying to do with the rainforest is say it's much more organic than that. It's much more dynamic than that. You can actually think of, just like in business, we think of business processes, we can think of economic processes in the same way. And so the rainforest analogy goes down to basically this, which is if you think about the industrial economy, the industrial economies are built where you actually know what the products are you want to build. So think of farms, for instance, where you have crops that you know in advance what you'd like to plant, and your goal is to actually maximize the productive yield of a crop. So you grow as much of a crop as you can. You use fertilizer. You water the soil. You actually grow that crop to maximize the profits, and you reduce the cost as much as possible. Now, if you get a weed on a farm, what do you do with a weed? Well, you kill the weed. You actually don't want weeds on farms. They're actually invasive, and they actually will reduce your crop yield. Now, contrast a farm, which is like an industrial model economy, to what we think of as a modern economy, like a rainforest. In a rainforest, what's a weed in a rainforest? Well, everything's a weed. Everything has the potential to grow up to become the most valuable plant in the forest, but you just don't know what it's going to be. And so, whereas if you're in a farm and you're trying to get rid of weeds, in a rainforest, you actually want to nurture weeds and you want to give each weed a chance to grow. And that's actually how innovative societies work. Every idea has the potential to turn into something extremely valuable. Every startup business has the potential to turn into, a really successful business, but you don't really know in advance. And so what you want to do is to nurture the growth of those weeds. And the thing about the farm and the rainforest, though, is if you think about what makes rainforests, well, on farms, you just grow plants, crops. You want to grow those crops. In a rainforest, how do you grow rainforests? Well, you can't just plant trees. In a rainforest, what it takes is actually the interaction of everything in the system. It's the sunlight, it's the nutrients in the soil, it's the humidity, it's the interaction between all the flora and fauna in the rainforest that cause it to thrive. Well, human economies are the same thing. Our societies are the same thing. It's the interaction of things that actually cause it to flourish. You can't just plant a bunch of businesses. You can't just plant a bunch of capital to actually expect an economic system. And if you've been in business, you know that's true. You can't just force systems to happen. You actually have to look at the interaction of things. And so when we look at how you nurture weeds in rainforests, how you nurture the interaction of all the components, you realize that ultimately it boils down to people, how people interact with one another, how they share resources with one another, how they collaborate with one another. And these all go back to culture, and those come from attitudes and mindsets that people have that are very deeply embedded. So what's inside people actually works its way out to how you actually transform systems. And so once you start to think of our economy or a society as a rainforest, then from that follows all sorts of conclusions around how you change, how you do business, how you change policy, how you actually create economic prosperity. Everything flows from that basic set of ideas. And this is not us just making up rainforests as an analogy. This actually flows from a whole body of science that's emerged in the last few decades called complexity science, which is to say that systems are not, most natural systems are complex. That is, they involve tons and tons of interactions. You can't possibly track them. You can't possibly model them out, but you can find underlying mechanisms that cause them to grow. And so when we think about rainforests and nurturing human rainforests, we're looking for those underlying mechanisms that can actually nurture the growth of the rainforest.
Fantastic intro. You've already, I hope, inspired a few people to think a little bit differently about how society works and business thrives. And I'm really glad that you talked about the individual psychology and culture of things, you know, the zeitgeist, if you would. We actually had a great discussion a few weeks ago with Keith Campbell, who's the author of The New Science of Narcissism. And it's a bit of a dirty word, but it speaks to how we balance ourselves and our relation with others. And I think those values and those forces and relations that you're talking about in the rainforest are exactly that. They're more than just an analogy. They're something that we find from these real scientific theories. And I've only just recently heard the term quantum biology, but I think that's a part of the whole science that is starting to emerge about how our minds work and how we relate in society through commerce. To me, it seems obvious why it's important, and I think you've touched on a few points. Did you want to say anything else about why it's so important that we understand this before I move on to some of the more detailed stuff that you've outlined in the book?
It's very important, I think, from a very practical side, just because, you know, we're in economic crisis right now, coming out of the pandemic, and if you we just got through a presidential cycle where people talked about small businesses, they talked about jobs, they talked about stock markets. But you hardly heard much talk around how innovation plays a role and how entrepreneurs, that is the new and young businesses, play a role in that process. There was a lot of preservation and crisis mode, and that's understandable in the kind of crisis we're in. But how do we actually pull out of a hole? Where do jobs come from? And all the evidence coming out in the last decade in terms of the research that shows where jobs come from, where GDP comes from, where prosperity comes from, shows it's actually the new, innovative, emerging businesses that drive that. But then when it comes to our economic debate in the country, it's largely crickets. You actually don't hear this issue talked about that much. And so that's why this is really important. And you can't just tackle it by throwing a bunch of money at stuff or building one giant government program. It's got to be a holistic lens by which you look at all of society. And this matters not just at the macroeconomy, but it matters at the level of, you know, individual cities or even towns or even neighborhoods. We know that the research coming out shows that even, you know, a 1% growth in the number of new businesses in a community actually raises the income level of a community on average by about $400. And so there actually is the potential to have a transformative effect in communities at large if we can actually rethink the way that we think about economic prosperity and growth. So it's very relevant today, and it's I think it's going to be hopefully something that we can open people's eyes about and think about, well, then how do you do it? How do you actually fix it? How do you actually drive that kind of growth?
On that point, Victor, do you think it's worth spending a minute and talking a little bit about what you describe as life in the rainforest in a bit more detail to paint a picture for people what that could look like?
Well, it's interesting, people that have been in highly innovative entrepreneurial environments actually know it. They experience it. And it's one of these things, if you've spent time in these types of places, whether it's in Silicon Valley or in Boston, in the MIT entrepreneurial ecosystem around biotech, or a bunch of other places, a bunch of communities have these kind of emerging entrepreneurial hubs. You know that it's just different. People talk differently, they behave differently, they even dress differently, and then you think, well, is that just superficial? Is that just, you know, stylistic? And what you find, if you really dig into this stuff and the science of it and understand what it is that makes people tick, you realize that people actually do behave differently, and the way they behave has an effect on the whole system itself. And I'll give you an example. So, for instance, I spent about a decade in Silicon Valley, and before I moved there, I always had, you know, this image of the Valley as a, you know, place of, you know, institutions and companies and funds. And when I got there, I realized it was actually a place of people. It was individuals that actually just acted differently. And some of the types of behaviors you don't find in large corporate environments or bureaucratic environments are very present in places like the Valley, which is it's not just people are faster and or take risk. It's even deeper than that. They make introductions to you faster. So if you move to the Valley and or any kind of entrepreneurial environment and you want to start something, you just start talking to people about it. And in fact, the more you share about it, the more people come and try to help you, and they start referring you to others. They'll say, "Hey, well, I know someone else starting a business like this. Let me introduce you to that person." Or, I just saw this really interesting research report. Let me email it to you. And what I found is if you go to a lot of more traditional environments, and this includes cities as well as entire countries, people don't do that. They hold back. They'll say, "You know what? Who are you? And why are you here? And why should I trust you? And who do you know? And what have you done before?" There's a lot of interrogation before people will jump in to help you. And what you find in really innovative environments is people just behave differently. They'll jump forward, they'll offer advice, they'll think of bigger ideas, they'll share resources with you, they'll send you articles to reference, they'll give you feedback. Even if they're not interested in joining you, they'll help you along the way because they know the journey themselves. And they know that you really don't know what something's going to look like till it's grown up, and it's worth helping out everybody along the way. There's a karmic value to the culture of these types of places. So they'll pay it forward. And if someone fails, you'll often find more empathy than you will find blame. People will actually understand because they've all been there before. Everyone knows what it's like to push a giant boulder up a mountain who's been in an entrepreneurial place, who built a startup business, who's actually created something against all odds. And so when you have an environment of people that respect that, they support that and nurture it. And what does that do for the whole system? Well, it speeds it up. Suddenly ideas, contacts, information isn't held away. It's actually opened up so it flows faster in the system. Just like in a natural rainforest, you'd want the nutrients in the system to actually flow faster to get to where it needs to go to the plant that needs it the most. In an entrepreneurial environment, you want the same thing. You want those resources to flow, and the people are the ones that make it flow, and their behavior is actually what causes that to happen.
Fascinating stuff. I think one of the things you've hinted at a few times, and you might have even already mentioned a few of them, are if we're going to help people work together and understand this new way of doing things, it might be useful to have a few rules. And you sketched a few in the book. Could you give us some examples of the rules of engagement in a healthy ecosystem?
Well, one of the ones I just mentioned was around paying it forward. So people willing to help each other out along the way because they have empathy and understanding and want to encourage other people to succeed. The other element is around respecting risk and the failures that happen along the way and the need to iterate. So the ability, if you think of like a more corporate environment or a more traditional environment, what people try to do is they tend to think about, well, how do you get it right the first time? People will say, a stitch in time saves nine, practice makes perfect. And those are types of models of thinking that are actually correct in environments where you already know what you're trying to make and you're trying to make it really, really well. And in fact, you're trying to decrease the odds of variation. But in an innovative rainforest environment, you actually want to increase variation. You want to take more risk. And so instead of trying to iterate things and if it fails, it fails. If it breaks, but keep trying to make it better each time. In a corporate environment, you want to actually say, get it right the first time and nail it, and let's not make mistakes. And so there's a contrast, if you think about that, between highly innovative values and culture and those that are more risk-taking, that are more risk-averse, rather, in corporate environments. And so that type of contrast, I think you find all the time. So another way to think about it is, the difference in pay it forward is where you give before you get anything back. In more traditional conservative corporate environments, there's more of a reciprocity that, well, I'll give you something if I know I'm going to get something back in return, or in fact, I only give it to you if I know I've already gotten value back from it. And so there's a quid pro quo that's assumed, that's transactional, highly transactional within more conservative environments. But if you think about what a rainforest environment looks like, where you're just giving people stuff and you're helping people out, well, what that does is it turns favors into a form of free-flowing currency in the system. It's not just barter. It's not just, I trade this for that. You're actually unleashing currency where people start giving favors out in systems, and then eventually it comes back to you. You're not exactly sure when that favor comes back. You send it out to one person by helping them out, and then it eventually comes back another way, and then you get it in a different form. But you see that happen all the time in the Valley. And when I think about the Valley, I actually think about the Valley more in terms of what it emerged from in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, not necessarily what it is today, where it's actually become much more around large institutions. But at the very heart of the Valley, that DNA that actually made it what it is, it was that type of value system that was actually present. And if you meet people who were part of the Valley back from the 70s and the 80s, they actually have that quality more than a lot of the people who've moved there in recent times.
I think, yeah, obviously that's a fascinating reminder because, yeah, Silicon Valley is obviously dominated by big tech and big government and big money these days, and a bit of ego as well, as we saw in Silicon Valley, the series. I'm here in Switzerland, and I've spent quite a few years working in the fintech community, which is all about changing a very stable industry, very corporate in banking. And Switzerland itself has a very stable, risk-averse culture, which coming from Canada, I have a lot of respect for. We've talked about the rules, but what can we talk about when it comes down to actually going about building an ecosystem like the one that was fostered in Silicon Valley?
It boils down to people. And so if you look at places like Silicon Valley and I also think about Austin, Texas. I actually grew up in Austin, Texas, and now that's become a hot spot as well. And you see a lot of these similar types of behavior over time that emerged. But if those places emerged organically. They largely were not intentionally designed to be the way they are. Austin maybe a little more so than Silicon Valley, but the Austin still had a lot of organic qualities to it. So ultimately, these were organic systems that grew from the interactions and the mindsets and the attitudes and the behaviors of the people, which means that if you're trying to build these types of entrepreneurial ecosystems, you actually have to focus on people first and understanding that it's the connections and the relationships and the actions between people that drive systems. So for instance, you can take that lens now and you can apply it into a whole bunch of different spheres. So for instance, if you're building an accelerator, for instance, for startup companies, are you weighting effort more towards helping people prepare, their business plans in isolation, or are you actually helping them get out into the community to make networks and build peer relationships and build mentoring relationships and build customer relationships and product relationships? Those types of relationships are key. And having, when you're building programs, for instance, that are trying to drive innovation, putting the people first and the attention to getting people in the door and building collaborative relationships as early on as possible is actually key because they have multiplier effects and they actually drive the rest of the system. Another example would be in terms of capital. So there's a lot of corporations that create corporate venture funds. There's regions and states that create geographical venture funds. Why do some work and some not work? Well, in part, it's their strategy and the economic environment and the investments they made. That's true. But there's another component to that, which I think comes out of the way that venture capital itself developed in Silicon Valley. Now, remember, in the mid-'70s, there pretty much was no venture capital industry in the Valley. It actually emerged out of the 50s and 60s, but by the 70s, it almost disappeared completely. And what interesting to note is out of the Valley environment, the capital players actually didn't have large funds to start with. They were essentially raising money into companies, initially one at a time, and then eventually those turned into funds that they could start to sustain. But those models, before they emerged, they were essentially people that worked on deals together, and they pooled their resources and their capital when they found really cool deals to work on. And so capital in the Valley, in the form of relationships where you can actually syndicate deals with other people, where you're actually building relationships that are deeply embedded in community, where you're trying to uphold the network and relationships to actually facilitate the flow of future deals is really, really important. And I'll give you an example. So when I've worked in other countries where they don't have robust venture capital industries, and the investors that come in will actually take extractive amounts of a company. Now, I know people in the US or even the Valley will say that companies are extractive, but you haven't seen extracted until you've seen what it's like in a lot of markets where they have not had successful VC. They'll have investors that will come in and tell an entrepreneur, I'll take 90% of your company in the angel round of investing. And the reason they do that is because they can. If capital is scarce and the entrepreneurs themselves are many, then capital can call the shots and actually take a huge amount of capital, a huge amount of equity for, even an angel level investment. You never find that in the Valley. You never find investors that will take anything even close to 90% in an angel round or even an A round or even a B round, because they know it's a mutual partnership. And so they've developed norms, they've developed standards on how you do deals that are actually much more collaborative and driven through mutual incentives. So they want to preserve incentive structures for everybody involved in the life of a company because they realize it truly is a partnership. And a great entrepreneur is actually the scarce commodity. There's actually capital, there's all sorts of capital to be made and invested. But if you can find a great entrepreneur, that's gold. And so if you think about that, it's actually really interesting how the VC industry involved in the Valley, where it actually started to think about and embody values around how do you actually sustain and grow long-term incentives that actually reward everybody. Another example would be in terms of policymaking. So, it may be, one thing where a government, and I know this is actually happening now a lot in the United States, is thinking around government stimulus and how is government going to spur, new job creation and economic growth. Well, it's, spending money is one thing, but spending money in the way that actually drives that growth is important. And that requires attention to, who is getting that money to do what and how are they behaving in their day-to-day lives that's different because of that money. So one of the things we've been talking about, and I've actually gotten a number of policymakers that are working on this, is around taking existing systems that traditionally reward large established companies and actually allocating some of those resources to entrepreneurial endeavors that actually could really benefit from those types of resources. So for instance, government contracting. So government contracts, procurement efforts normally go towards large established incumbents because they know how to navigate the bureaucracy, they know how to get certified, they know the right procurement officers, they know they're able to compete because traditional contracting requires several years of track record. Well, if you're a new business, if you're an entrepreneur, it's hard to get access to those government contracts. You don't know how to navigate, you don't know, you don't have the track record, you don't have a lot of these things. Even if your product is better, even if you're more innovative, even if you'll deliver better, they don't know because the system doesn't reward that. And so those types of system adjustments are actually really important. So if government contracting just awarded 5% of their contracts to emerging businesses, that would have a catalytic effect across an entire system. But that type of thinking mode hasn't really emerged in the way we think about entrepreneurial support systems because we tend to assume it's a level playing field when it's not. And what we need to do is to realize that that playing fields are almost always tilted against the newcomer. They're almost always tilted towards incumbents. And so that's a way to start thinking about the system, which is how hard it is to start a business, how fragile it is when those relationships form and people start to work on a business, and rewarding and providing extra incentive for people that are willing to take on that risk is actually really important.
Super critical points that you're highlighting there. So thank you, Victor. I don't know if you wanted to say anything further about capital. You said quite a lot there, but it really is one of those main incentives that's at the center of it all, isn't it?
People always say, well, we need more capital. And entrepreneurs are often the first to say, capital is a problem. But it's really interesting because money is everywhere, but capital is not. So what's the difference between money and capital? And this is actually at the core of rainforest thinking, which is, well, capital is just money attached with people that are using it in different ways and structuring it in different ways that actually enable entrepreneurial growth to happen. So if you think about how money becomes capital, then you can think around, well, how do we actually cause more money to become capital? And if you think about that, then you start to realize, well, there's actually a lot of different ways you could actually cause money to become capital. A lot of people talk about tax incentives, which are kind of straightforward and not inherently bad because they actually do incentivize certain types of behavior. But are we really driving that shift from money into capital, and capital that actually can take risk into entrepreneurship? And I'll give you an example of the types of things that the U.S. has actually pioneered abroad and other countries have pioneered that we haven't even tried at home, in part because I think Americans often think of that they're exceptional. They don't need to copy things that happen abroad. But if you look at the capital markets in places like Israel, Israel has the most successful venture capital market in the world per capita. Well, how did that start? Well, that was actually a government intervention. There was a fund called the Yosma Fund starting in the early 90s that invested as a fund of funds into the whole first generation of venture capital firms in Israel. And now they've been through many, many rounds of that. And almost all the major venture capital funds of Israel got their early anchor commitments from the Yosma Fund in Israel to help jumpstart and catalyze a new capital formation. That model that worked in Israel was ported into Latin America, which became the Multilateral Investment Fund under the Inter-American Development Bank. And that has spurred on the order of 200 or so venture capital funds across Latin America. In fact, you could argue the birth of the entire Latin American venture capital industry was spurred by the development of a fund of funds that was the first money committed to catalyze new capital markets in Latin America. And the irony of all that is a big chunk of that money for the Inter-American Development Bank's Multilateral Investment Fund came from the U.S. taxpayer. So U.S. tax dollars have gone into building capital markets in other places, but we've never really done that at home in the U.S. And to think about what that means going forward, if there's a real issue around capital access in the U.S., which is true, then how do we address it? And there are a lot of great examples across the world on how to do so. And I think that we should learn from those lessons and talk about them proactively on how we can do that. And capital access is a serious issue. And a lot of people just assume, well, the markets are fine in the U.S. It's worth pointing out that 83% of businesses in the U.S. access neither traditional banking or venture capital. So 83% of the businesses in the U.S. don't have access to what we normally think of as the capital markets. And so that is the typical business today. And there's a lot of shifts that have happened in the market that we can go into. But basically, the markets are not fitting the needs of the entrepreneurs today when it comes to capital. And there's a lot of work that can be done.
I wish we had enough time to talk about it all. This is really my passion as well when it comes to fintech and maybe coming back to things that we can focus on, the idea of system design. And when it comes to designing rainforests, you came up with a pretty useful model that you've adapted from some others. Do you want to talk just a moment about the Rainforest Canvas and how that can be put to use?
We've developed a canvas that just like there's a lean startup canvas, there's all sorts of canvases you can use to actually do innovative work to bring people's ideas together. We developed a Rainforest Canvas on helping design ecosystems, and that's free as a resource. You can go to my website, which is victorh.co, victorh.co, and we've got a free canvas there for you. That's also got links to a bunch of other resources on building entrepreneurial ecosystems, a Rainforest Scorecard model that you can use for scoring and doing assessment of rainforest ecosystems. And that canvas, we've used that all over the world, and it's highly successful. Essentially, you can use it in tables, you can use it on whiteboards, you can use it in any kind of environment. We've done collaborations of up to 500 people with these types of canvases. And what they're great at doing is they actually they ask all the questions, and it pulls out your thinking in terms of what are the things that exist in our rainforest, and then what can be done to help fill some of these gaps. And so by asking the right questions, you actually generate the right solutions. And that's what that Canvas set is really useful for. I encourage people to go there and check it out.
Indeed. I found it really interesting when I was looking at things here in Switzerland and looking at where we could move some of the key culture points in particular, but also leverage a lot of the advantages that were in existence. When it comes to looking at rainforests, I think it is still worth mentioning how do we measure the results? And a lot of those who are in the financial industry are numbers people. So I think that's important to say. But we're looking, I think, a little bit beyond just the financial return of the rainforest when we talk about that, right? Can you give us some more information about how you can measure our rainforest?
We developed a system called the Rainforest Scorecard. That's also available on my site. And it was actually the pilot project was funded by the Department of Commerce's Economic Development Administration to actually assess economies at scale, and it was modeled off of a lot of the types of scoring systems that corporations have used, such as Lean, Six Sigma, the Baldrige system. Those models that came out of W. Edwards Deming were actually a model that we used for this rainforest work, because what that does is it looks at the whole system and realizes that you can't understand and change an economy without actually getting into the root system itself and actually talking to the people and actually stimulating conversation among the people that allows them to grow their ideas organically upwards within an organizational structure. And so we started to say, well, large corporations have used these types of systems like Lean and Six Sigma and others to drive wide-scale transformation. Why hasn't anyone developed that for an economy or a society, or to create innovative environments even within a corporation? And so that's what we built. The Rainforest Scorecard is like a parallel model to what a lean system would be in a corporation. But whereas a lean system strives for squeezing out the inefficiencies and waste, a rainforest actually strives for the types of behaviors that cause new ideas to emerge and to support the growth of those weeds. So in some sense, it's sort of an opposite counterpart to what a lean systems model might look like. A large-scale economic transformation model can't just focus on efficiency of the system. You actually got to focus on how you cause the interesting things and the value to get produced and emerged within an economy. So encourage people to take a look at the Rainforest Scorecard. It's really self-explanatory. It's free online, but you can also buy copies of it and share it and use it in communities. We've seen people use them across entire provinces. So the whole province of Alberta, Canada, has used the Rainforest Scorecard, and you can actually look on their websites. They actually do a whole scoring and mapping process and track over time the growth of their scores in this area. So it's just fascinating work, and we're pleased that people are using it like that.
Absolutely. Well, congratulations on your impact with all of this, Victor. I'm a big believer in social impact, and that being a new frontier in untapping human potential. And I think we've talked already a number of times about the different scales that the rainforest model can be applied on. So why don't we leave that for a minute and take some time to talk a bit more about your project, The Right to Start?
Sure. So Right to Start is an organization I launched about a year ago, and it emerged out of my time at the Kauffman Foundation. So for 4 years, I was the head of entrepreneurship at the Kauffman Foundation, which is the world's leading philanthropy for entrepreneurial development. It's been that way. It's been a pioneer in this area for about 3 decades, and I had the privilege of running their work in entrepreneurship for a number of years. And one of the things that became really clear out of that is how much we're missing something in terms of entrepreneurship and innovation in the country, which is there's a hole where there should be hope. Specifically, how are we engaging this issue in our civic discourse, in our political life, in the ordinary way that citizens think about this issue? And so Right to Start was built as a campaign to elevate the issue of entrepreneurship across society and to make entrepreneurial opportunity available for everybody. If you look at issues that matter in our lives, there's usually some kind of advocacy infrastructure in place. So if you believe in civil liberties, you've got the ACLU. If you believe in guns rights, you've got the NRA. But if you believe in entrepreneurial opportunity as a fundamental issue, what do you join? Who speaks for you? How do you participate in that kind of broader mission? Well, there really hasn't been anything like that before. And so that's why we built Right to Start. And we think of Right to Start really as a right. That is, just like you've got a right to speech, you've got a right to worship, you've got a right to assemble, you've got a right to be an entrepreneur. It's a right to start. In fact, the role of a society should be to nurture that human flourishing, that human potential. The entrepreneurial potential is in everybody. Even if you don't formally start a business, it's the ability to invent and to create and build and make and potentially control your life through making a living off of your own talents. And so we call that the right to start. And we encourage people to come and join. We're engaging in helping tell better stories through media. We're actually changing policy. We're actually looking at drafting legislation to change and enable the right to start in various cities and states. And then we're doing community organizing. We've got 10 communities now where we have right to start networks in place, and we're continuing to grow that. Our plan is by America's 250th birthday to have 100 chapters across the country and 100,000 citizens engaged in this effort. We don't want another election cycle to go by where entrepreneurship isn't front and center as an issue that actually helps drive job growth and productivity, but also, more importantly, drives flourishing, community empowerment, and actually a better quality of life for everybody.
Well, if there's anything we can do from here in Switzerland, the land of human rights, I'll see what I can do in Geneva in the meantime. But it sounds like you've got enough on your plate there in America, and it's desperately needed with all the opportunity to unleash. We talked a little bit earlier in the discussion about deep science and some of the insights that we've gained from the organic world. And it always strikes me as somebody who studied philosophy and then went into the quasi-science of financial markets. There's a certain amount of mysticism in all of this. As much as we think we know things, we're always discovering that it's still a bit of a mystery. And I think you've talked about that as well with the ecosystem rainforest and how startup innovation can really be developed. Can you say a little bit more about that magical place and some of the weird things that we just still can't quite figure out there?
Well, there's it's interesting. We know more about the surface of Mars and than we do about the human process of innovation and what goes on in the heads and the hearts of men and women who are acting in innovative ways every day. So it is still this great mystery, but the science is getting closer to it. There's actually one of my professors from college is named Edward O. Wilson. He is people have often called him the greatest biologist to ever be alive since Charles Darwin. And E.O. Wilson has actually developed a body of thought called consilience, which is that all bodies of knowledge are connected to one another, which makes perfect sense. I mean, just we segment knowledge between biology and chemistry and physics just because that's the way it emerged over time as disciplines. But he's saying they're all connected together. And what's happening over time is the hard sciences are better able to explain the social sciences. That is, the more we understand now about how the human mind works and how how animals are successful in ecosystems, the more we learn about ourselves in terms of how we can actually build these ecosystems productively. And so some of the science that's coming out specifically around sociobiology and how creatures work in networks and collaborative systems actually are becoming really useful. And one of the big insights out of Edward O. Wilson's work and a bunch of work around evolutionary biology is that there's actually a difference evolutionarily between certain types of behavior. What they call pro-social behaviors, where you're actually generous and you're giving and you're helpful to others and you have empathy for what others are going through and you support them, actually create more competitive, successful societies, not just in human societies, but in other types of creatures as well. And that systems that are kind of zero-sum, where people are at each other's throats trying to defeat each other, will often tend to degenerate, and they'll often tend to not thrive as species. And so there's something about human beings and our ability to collaborate at scale that's actually very, very special. And Wilson talks about the campfire and how you can actually trace everything back to the campfire. If you think about, if you go back 100,000 years in human history and you think about people sitting around a campfire, what do? They talked about where to find the food, how to hunt it, how to cook it, how to take care of the kids, the best places for shelter. And the campfire was where people started to learn how to share information about the day, and then allowed their friends, first family, and then eventually people that may not have been blood related to, eventually they started to share information to start to be able to do more than just what you could do alone. So it's not just what we can do alone with our hands and our feet. It's our ability to actually use other people in our network, like a startup company, to take on different roles. So one person goes out to hunt for this thing, one person goes out to build that resource for that, another person goes out to look for shelter in a different way. Once you start to be able to think about the campfire as like a startup company or an innovative product, then you start to realize, well, we can actually use those same types of models all the time, because that's what makes human beings so successful. And so when you start to think like that, the magical seems perhaps more understandable and not so mysterious.
Absolutely. Yeah. I could say a few things about that, but it echoes back to, again, what we talked about with Keith Campbell and the subject of narcissism and how we balance what we need ourselves and what others need around us, and the sort of flow of our interaction in society. And I sometimes like to think back to evolution and a little bit further and think at some point there were two reptiles fighting over something, and they realized, maybe they should share. Maybe one of them should have it this time, the other one next time. Or as you say, maybe they could divide the labor and increase the size of the pie. So I think evolution is one of the best scientific proofs of this type of thinking about how to develop innovation even as we go forward. So it's great that you've done all this with your book to highlight that further. And it sounds like there's loads more to be discovered in the coming years. So looking forward to keep in touch. Before I do let you go, I wanted to ask a couple last questions, Victor. Outside of the natural world and some of the fantastic influences you mentioned, like E.O. Wilson, where do you find inspiration, and how do you keep yourself grounded as things speed up and the world becomes more complex?
I'm always looking for new sources of creativity and inspiration, and I think especially in the past year with this pandemic, it's actually been pretty tough. But I think oftentimes people we like to segment out different realms of knowledge. So we think, well, innovation in business is innovation in business. Innovation in the arts is innovation in the arts. They're all separate and distinct from one another. But I actually don't think so. I actually think entrepreneurship is a form of artistry. Innovation is a form of artistry too. So I actually think, and I try to draw inspiration from a bunch of other sources. So just this past week has been the Sundance Film Festival. And for the first time, it was online. And anyone that's been a lover of film but could never make it out to Park City or couldn't afford Park City before was able to access the Sundance Film Festival over the past week. And it was beautiful. I watched a bunch of movies from the comfort of my home that I could never, even if you've been to Sundance, it's even hard to get around to all these different films because they have long lines and it's super competitive. And this time you could actually see all this stuff. But one thing they did that was really interesting was they had virtual environments where you could talk to strangers and engage in talking about the films. And you could actually put on goggles, like VR goggles, and walk up to people and you could see their faces. It's a fascinating environment. And it just shows that, these types of issues around technology and society and collaboration and innovative product design, you could see it even at a place like Sundance. You get a sense of the future, and the ability for people to work at scale in these virtual environments is coming. And a place where traditionally you thought it was about film is actually a place where actually learning how to share information in VR is fascinating. They've got a whole part of Sundance around the new frontier work around VR and AR and really highly experimental filmmaking, which is fascinating. And I think a lot of people in business should check it out because you'll get a sense on where a lot of the creative energy is getting spent these days, which is certainly going to impact the rest of us down the line.
I'm really glad you mentioned the example you did. The arts community is something we, even on this channel, draw a lot of inspiration from. And I often like to use Andy Warhol's quote about business and art and money and art, which business he thinks is the highest form of art. So I think you've echoed that there. And I think it's a funny example of where patronage sort of shows the tandem nature of things. You have to have artists and you have to have business. So the two go hand in hand and inspire each other. With that, Victor, I want to ask you, are there any final thoughts you'd like to leave with our audience, especially if you have any comments around the fintech scene and how it's developing?
I think, two quick thoughts. One is we typically think of entrepreneurship as something that other people do, and that we kind of benefit from the rewards if they succeed. And, if they fail, well, that's too bad. Well, I think we should get people to start to realize that their contributions matter, that entrepreneurs are the front line of economic recovery and economic growth, but they can't do it alone. They actually need an ecosystem. They need others that participate and support them. And so there's a lot of things that we can do as individuals to support entrepreneurs, whether it's just talking about them, promoting your friends who are entrepreneurs, help being a first product user for a new entrepreneur that's launched something new, talking about the issue to policymakers and your leaders. There's a bunch of things you can do to just support the issue of entrepreneurship and entrepreneurs in your life. That's important. The other issue is around fintech and the power of fintech to break down transaction costs and to remove barriers for capital flows to people that need it with really innovative ideas. There's a really powerful moment in time we have right now to design a fintech sector that actually rewards and works and fits the entrepreneurial economy that's happening today. I mentioned that 83% of entrepreneurs are not accessing the traditional capital markets, whether it's banking or venture capital. Well, why is that? And what do we have to build to actually cause that to happen? And you're seeing really interesting work in terms of how do you do credit scoring on new entrepreneurs that don't have a track record? How do you reduce the transaction costs so you can do a $1,000 loan as efficiently as you could do a $300,000 loan? How do you actually identify entrepreneurs that need capital and structured in the right way? So it's not necessarily a traditional banking relationship or a traditional venture capital relationship, but some kind of profit sharing or revenue sharing model that allows for some spectrum of engagement. So it's not just vanilla or chocolate ice cream. You actually have a whole bunch of flavors in the middle that fit the particular needs of a business. There's a lot of things that can be done in fintech and that need to be done. And I encourage people to think more imaginatively and broadly around all types of financial products that don't currently exist. And then the entrepreneurs that are out there that are looking for you to come up with these new types of financial services. Huge opportunity. And I'd say it's one of the most exciting aspects in the world today is in terms of what fintech can do to actually spur and grow the next wave of our economy.
Thank you very much for saying that, Victor. I hope to get you over here once COVID's over so that we can share that message with some of the global leaders of the financial services industry and many of the important folks who are working on social matters from here in Switzerland, because I couldn't agree more. It's a linchpin in the future of society and the digital economy. So making the connection between finance, fintech, and the entrepreneurial rainforest is something that I'm glad that we were able to do today, and I hope we're able to get the message out broader. So continued success with the work to Right to Start, and yeah, thank you again for joining us this evening.
Thank you, John. I'd love to go to Switzerland sometime. I love Switzerland, and good luck, and thanks for all your great work as well.
My pleasure. Again, thanks very much, Victor. Take care.
Yep, take care.